Here's your host, Alex Garrett.
Welcome inside to Alex Garrett and podcasting. And some of you may not know, but sometimes I walk around New York with this small town feeling like I just love being out of the city. I love being in sort of a small town setting because the city can go rough and tumble. That being said, I don't even want to lose the city and the people that have left it, 120,000. But I feel like my next guest has some ideas on how to maybe balance both. And my guest is Nick Lyons. He's an author of Fire in the Straw, Notes on Inventing a Life. First of all, Nick, so glad to meet you, and thanks for joining today.
I'm just delighted to be here, Alec.
Now, you have a doctor. You've got 4 kids, and you write about your life in this book. But I want to first get to why this whole idea from shifting to the city to rural America and whatnot fascinates you.
Well, I have lived in cities all my life, and I've always had a passion for fishing, as it were, fly fishing, and for the country. I felt that I wanted more country in me. And at a certain time in my life, about, it's just a little more than 20 years ago, I picked up roots and went to Woodstock, which is about 2 hours from the city, from New York City. And it was a totally different life. We mostly lived there for about 20 years. And then after my wife died and my oldest son died of melanoma, which he'd had, I had moved back to the city to be near the rest of my family. So I'm not an example of someone who left permanently. But I did leave because I wanted more simplicity. I'd lived a very complicated life in New York, never enough money to survive with my big family, always in debt, holding 3 full-time jobs at one time. And the country seemed like a different world. Simplicity, says Thoreau. Let your affairs be as 1 in 10, not 10 in 1,000. And I just wanted things calmer and simpler and less pressured than New York.
Well, as you could tell, Nick Lyons, my guest, he's an English professor. He loves the English language, as you could tell right there. But are you surprised that more than half, or at least half of Americans now want to go into a rural setting? Knowing that you've been there, are you surprised that people do want to leave the city?
I am. The city, for a younger person who has not got particularly the financial problems that I had at that time, the city is a very engaging place. I loved it, and I still do, though I can't do much about it at the age of 88. But it has the great museums of the world. It has great theater, great movies, interesting people. And the notion of moving to a simpler life, in part, seems like the number of people going doesn't surprise me with the COVID around and the absence of a lot of the joys and pleasures that one normally has. But what interested me about it, and what seems to me in a sense true, is that the desire for a simpler life is very often not the desire for a wiser or better life. I don't think it is. I made very good use of it. My children were grown. I had a wonderful 20 years, but I came back.
I totally see that, in a younger person, but as you're talking, I wonder, is there ever, because you came back, but are there people out there starting to not fall in love with New York City? I mean, we always thought we wouldn't fall out of love, but is that happening?
Yes, I'm afraid it does. There's a wonderful quote by Samuel Johnson about London, and he says, when you stop loving London, you've stopped loving life, that life is London. And in a sense, New York has that quality also. And I fear that the people leaving are, in a sense, backing out of life, and they don't realize that they should come with something to do out there. Otherwise, they're going to feel the absence of all the excitement of a great city. which this is.
You know,
I've seen it. I mean, I've seen a lot of people who went to Woodstock in the last year or so who are at first very excited by it and then very concerned that it's not the life they want.
well, how did you say you moved back to the city, so what pulled you back in? What was aside from family, what else pulled you back in to come back to New York?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things is that I have other family here. I have 3 children, 4 grandchildren, and a lot of friends that I had made in the 40 years that I lived in the city. Another reason was that I had left the city because the country seemed simpler and also much less expensive. But it turns out that keeping the house, particularly when you're heating it in the winter, that the country can be more expensive, and that what you go out after is not what you're going to get. It actually is a lot more economical for me to live in an apartment here. I don't have a financial problem anymore, having sold a business, and I think that it's something that one should consider very carefully before one does go. I know that everyone's leaving now, or a lot of people are leaving, and I know they think it's for a simpler life and a better life, but it isn't necessarily so. The country is filled with the difficulties of running a household, dealing with all the problems yourself rather than having a landlord do so. And it's for some people, but not for all people. I like being back. I like the security of it. I like the help I get in an apartment. I like having the house off my back. And I like having a lot of people that I know here. And also, as soon as the COVID vanishes a little bit, I'm going to like using the museums and the great libraries and the great movies and live theater and opera and all the rest of it.
Nick, I'm so glad you said that you feel like you know a lot of people here in New York City. I think for residents here, from the outside perspective, no one would think this is a small town. But if you're a resident here, you kind of know a lot of people. Doesn't there still seem like a small town feel here in a big city as well?
Yes, it does. I mean, I think the way in which we build a world of our own. I did so through the school when I was teaching at Hunter College. I did so through the families of my children, who were the 4 of them as they were growing up. I got to know them, their brothers and sisters, their parents, and there were worlds within worlds. New York is not just an amorphous big place with a lot of excitement. It is many small worlds within it. The difficulty is, for some people, is the difficulty of earning a living. It's a hard place to find the right job. It's a hard place to find the right money to support a way of life that you're almost forced to buck in. And 4 children it was. And it was very hard for me when I was here at first. And I left and enjoyed the country, but I did not enjoy it after my wife died, my oldest son died, and I felt I wanted to be closer to the action, so to speak.
Nick, to that point, my podcast is about adapting. So what are the adaptations you made? And I know you say you reinvented yourself. Talk a little bit about that adaptation to the country, back to the city, and then yourself as well.
Yes, I think adaptation is the key to both of my moves. When I moved to the country, I could support myself there. I wanted the free time. I knew what to do with free time. And it was not a question of adapting to a community. I basically wanted to do my work. It was editing, which I could do any place, and also writing. I read something like 12 books while I was in Woodstock during those 20 years, and essays and stories and a lot of other things. I think the adaptation comes with what you're able to bring to it. And as a result, I enjoyed having a house. I enjoyed
shopping, being in control of everything that went on in that little community. And I enjoyed a new kind of friend, a friend who could invite you to sit on his back porch rather than meet you at a restaurant and have dinner with you. I think that adaptation is partly the result of what you bring. And when I came back to the city, it was time to do so. I wanted better medical attention of a variety of kinds, and I wanted to have my the rest of my family around me. I couldn't drive anymore, so it wasn't the time to be up in the country. But I think that quality of adaptation, that ability to learn new things, to show up rather than calling in a list, the ability to buy the things you need for the house and set up housekeeping, was very exciting. And particularly the amount of time that I had, since I tend to write for long periods of time, 10, 12 hours in a day sometimes. So that adaptation was partly who I was and partly what I wanted, and not running away from something so much as going to something that I knew something about. I think that quality of adapting is something that I think we all have to have, and more we're going to have it because these incredible pandemics and the basic difficulty of most jobs. Most of the work that goes on in a publishing house today is not the same thing that went on even 10 years ago. There are new machines, there are new to adapt to. I have had a great deal of difficulty adapting to the simple use of a computer. And I think that some of the mechanical things that I can't do hamper me a great deal. But young people are going to have to learn them. They're going to have to learn every one of them.
Nick,
in order to hold their jobs and so forth. Yeah,
Nick, I love that. And I was just going to ask you, being that you're 88, social media to you, speaking of the whole rural versus city, I think if we take too many pictures of the rural side, you were able to write books when you were up there and focus on that. Do you think our technology is taking focus off nature, off the rural, off the country life, as well as off city life as well?
Well, I think it's going to be absolutely necessary for people to learn the technology and to bring it with them. I think there is no reason to write on I had an Underwood standard typewriter for all of my life until about 6 or 7 years ago. And then for a number of reasons, I decided to switch to a computer. But I think having the ability to use the technology gives you one more asset if you go to the country. It's maybe harder to find somebody to fix your computer, but there's an awful lot of difference between pecking away at an Underwood standard and the simplicity and ease of using a computer. I think technology has brought a lot of people pleasure in the country, and I think that going with those things is for many people a good idea. Now I know there are a lot who relish the more rustic life. They want a rustic life. They want something where they are involved with the growing of their own food, for instance, which you don't do in the city. I was less interested in that, but I respect it and enjoy someone else's tomatoes, so to speak.
You know, I got to ask you, Nick, do you still have that typewriter, or do you still use one?
I do. I think there are times when I have to do something and I don't want to go to Word, which I don't use very well. I don't want to hire somebody to do it for me. I like the old machine. It was reliable. It didn't have never lost everything I'd written, which this machine in front of me has done twice, where I've written an essay, which is what I mostly write, and it has vanished. I pushed the wrong key or done something, and it just doesn't exist. I like the old typewriter because it is reliable in that respect.
But you seem like sort of the romantical type where just the typing on the typewriter is cathartic for you as well.
I have liked it that way. I was pretty good at it, and I would often type for many hours at a time. I never had any of those problems with fingers tightening up or arthritis. I was lucky to avoid them. But it is cathartic. I was an athlete when I was younger and played college basketball for the University of Pennsylvania. And I know that when the studying became too hard, I would go to the gym, and the gym would provide me with some respite from too much thinking or too much tension. I think using some of these old machines can be cathartic, just as you say. But I'm at my age, I don't need the cathartic as much. What I need is some instrument to help me put the stories or the essay down on paper and worry about what's in it rather than how it got there.
Well, now you've written A Fire in the Straw, and I want to. I'm not saying this jokingly, but how did you write it? Now I'm curious how you wrote A Fire in the Straw.
I write almost everything by hand first. I never compose on a machine. I didn't compose on the typewriter. And there were some sections when I wanted to look at them very carefully when I triple spaced them on the typewriter. So I had plenty of room in between the lines and could really think about the phrasing very exactingly. But I write it, as everything is written first by hand, usually transposed to some kind of typing. After I had gotten the draft, next to the last draft, and then I'd have a last draft put on computer. Either I would do it or I'd have some young person put it on for me, and then I'd go back and do the final corrections on it. But the old hand and pencil and pen worked very well, and then I would use the typewriter now and then, not as often as I used to. But I do rewrite a lot. Being an editor, I get a chance to look at something very, very carefully. And I don't particularly like to make a fire by rubbing sticks together when there's a good match around or a good gas burner. It doesn't give me any more pleasure to do something in the more difficult way. But it does a lot of people. A lot of people want to go back to the more primitive, the more involving of your whole life, and less of those things which abstract it, which make it easier, presumably, or less direct.
Well, Nick, so tell us about the book, because I'm very curious about the book now. So you want to reinvent yourself, and it sounds to me that the story you write is about just that.
Well, it's an interesting life. My father died before I was born, 3 months before, of pneumonia, and my mother had a very tough time of it. I was sent to a boarding school very early when I was 5 years old. I had a rough time there, a very lonely time. Somehow I got into a pattern of wasting a lot of my life on athletic matters. I had played basketball very hard. I loved fishing, and I still think of it with some gratitude. But it consumed too much of my life when I was young. And I got to be a very reluctant student at Penn, studying something I didn't like, insurance, with the thought of going into my stepfather's insurance business. And I went into the Army, and in the kind of free time you have in the Army, particularly the Peace Army, of course, when she was in the early 50s, I began to read for the first time really in my life. I'd pick up a book and read it, which I never did. I only read what was assigned, and only then to get the information to pass a course. I've been a terrible student. And I think looking at my life hard on a little installation in France, U.S. Army installation in a corner of France, I began to see something else that I wanted to do. I wanted to understand this world of literature, which I'd never had any contact with. So when I came back to the States, I really took this old life and just summarily threw it over. I went back to school as a freshman. I went to college.
And how old were you then?
Under the GI Bill. What's that?
How old were you then? It sounds like you were a little older when you got to college. So what was the age range that you went back?
I was 24 or 25. And all of the friends that I had in school, at the working school, were in business, had families, were starting up things. And I remember telling my stepfather I wanted to go back to school as a freshman, start all over again. He thought I was insane. And I guess many of my friends thought the same thing. But I had studied insurance in college. I could not stand it. I had no interest in it. It's a perfectly good field, but it wasn't my field. And the title, Fire in the Straw, really has to do with an old quotation I found that says, "The tiger cannot hide its claws. Fire cannot be hidden in the straw, but at last it will have its course, it will come out." And I had this little fire in me, this little passion, and I didn't know where to go with it. I didn't know whether I could earn a living at it. I didn't know whether I had hated most schools. I didn't know whether I could go into teaching. And it was a moment when I really had to invent myself and determine what I wanted to do. I remember taking a speed reading course, and the woman told me that I was stupid to try to do this, and I should go back to the insurance business. And the phrase she used was, "Saints with power of levitation couldn't get out of the hole you dug, Nick."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, no, I'm not going to do this. So I finished study of literature for a year and a half in the city at the New School and then at Bard College. And I happened to have met a woman that I fell in love with, which I had not before had a girlfriend, really. And married her that summer and trailed her where she was in graduate school in art. She was a painter. And we went out to Michigan. I went on, forced myself again, went on and got an MA and a PhD eventually, at which time I really felt like a different person. And we had a long marriage of 58 years, a very beautiful one, I thought. I loved her work, and we were very much in love. We had 4.
Well, there's no doubt that impacted your life so much that you wanted to write about her in the book as well. Nick, I've got to ask you this: your love of literature also led you to create the Lyons Press, did it not?
That's right. One of the second job I had to take while I was teaching at Hunter College, I had to take a second job session and began to work for Crown Publishers. I became the executive editor at Crown. And then someone came and said, an Englishman said, "Why don't you start a subsidiary for his company in England?" And I started one on my dining room table. And then he was discharged, the man who had made the contact was discharged from his firm, and I was cut loose. I was told that I would sell what I had or else I could buy it. And I raised some money, bought it, started a business of my own, and eventually built it to some size, and $8 or $10 million worth of business a year. One of my sons was very adept at business, and in a sense took it over, and we sold it for a very, very nice profit. At that time, I immediately decided that I wanted to do all the writing that I had always wanted to do, but always was too busy to do. But, the change came when I went from teaching to publishing. I didn't know anything about publishing at all. I just wrote to 100 publishers in New York City, and Crown Publisher was the only people that got back to me. I took a job there, and about 10 or 12 years I became the executive editor and showed a real aptitude for it. But by that time I was in my 40s, and it was a new world. I went from the teaching world, which I loved and was a good teacher, even though I had hated school, and then went from that to publishing, and from working for somebody to owning a place of my own, which did very well.
Nick, this conversation is so important that I'd love to have you back. We're going to do this the rest of the interview tomorrow, but a reminder, Fire in the Straw, Notes on Inventing Life by Nick Lyons. So excited to have him, and we'll be back with him tomorrow. And remember, we are always adapting.